All right, let's continue looking at the major characteristics for all arthropods by looking at the next external characteristics. All right, the third major characteristic is all arthropods have an exoskeleton made with chitin. So we've got the bilateral symmetry and segmented appendages, and the reason those appendages need to be segmented is because all arthropods have an exoskeleton made with this chitin. An exoskeleton is the structural anatomy of arthropods, and it's found on the external surface of the organism. We as humans have an endoskeleton. Our structural anatomy is found inside our flesh and muscles. Arthropods, on the other hand, wear those like a suit of armor. That means they have to have some very different anatomy to make things work. So this exoskeleton is very stiff and very hard. It's made up of a substance that allows for a lot of different functions that has evolved over millions and millions of years to help protect and allow these organisms, these arthropods, to survive in the world. So the form of the exoskeleton is primarily due to its physical makeup. It is made up of a substance called chitin. So chitin is a interesting polymer. It's a long chain polymer of something we call N-acetylglucosamine. Okay, so when I say the N here, N in chemistry just relates to some number, right? So N is just a stand-in for a number. It could be 1, it could be 1,000,000, it could be 10, it could be 12. In this case, we're just counting up how many molecules of acetylglucosamine are all put together in a chain. So in this case, N, let's say it's 10, just molecules of acetylglucosamine, are all linked together, and they look like this. Now, you don't have to memorize this exact format. I just want you to know the name N-acetylglucosamine. Okay, so it's these rings of carbon and hydrogen and oxygen and nitrogen all put together to form chitin. Okay, now this is a derivative of the sugar glucose. That's why the name glucosamine is in there. Okay, so that's what it looks like here. So see how these rings kind of remind you of those carbon rings that make up glucose? Yeah, think back to your basic chemistry. This is what glucose looks like with a couple of little things sort of stuck on the side there. Now, you might have heard the term glucosamine if you're super into working out or you're super into health supplements, things like that. You can buy glucosamine in pills. It's supposed to be good for your joints and for your cartilage and various other things. People who work out a lot tend to take glucosamine supplements in order to keep their joints mobile and nice. We get glucosamine from the exoskeleton of arthropods. The next time you buy glucosamine or you're in a store and you see glucosamine, look on the bottle. There will be a little warning that says if you are allergic to shellfish, do not take this product, because that allergen, that protein that is causes an allergy in shellfish is found in the exoskeleton here. So N-acetylglucosamine, a certain number of acetylglucosamine molecules all in a big long chain that make up chitin. Now, in its unmodified form, chitin is translucent, pliable, really, really resilient, and very, very tough. It is hard to break or tear. However, it is heavily modified in arthropods. It's embedded with a protein called scleritin. This is a tanned protein matrix, which lends a stiffness and a hardness to the exoskeleton. This is why you have to crack the shell of a crab or a cockroach crunches when you step on it. It's that N-acetylglucosamine studded with that scleritin that makes it crunchy or crabby or whatever. So this amount, the amount of scleritin in the exoskeleton depends on the species, depends on the group, which means different arthropods can have different pliability to those exoskeletons. So think about all the different insects you've seen out in the world, right? There are some that are really, really hard to crunch, really, really hard to squish. Others are very, very soft. If you say pick up a caterpillar or some of those, or a butterfly, much softer than say some of these beetles that are out there, right? So there you go. It has to do with that exoskeleton, how much scleritin is embedded within that acetylglucosamine matrix. Now, the chemical makeup of the exoskeleton gives it some important jobs for the insect. First and foremost, the exoskeleton is mechanical protection for the arthropod. It works just like a suit of armor, covering and protecting the softer muscles, the vessels, and the organs found inside the organism. Second, the exoskeleton works as a place for muscle attachment. Just like the way muscles attach to our bones to allow for our own movement, muscles attach to ridges and points inside the exoskeleton to allow the arthropod to move those appendages. This type of muscle attachment has some distinct advantages over our own endoskeleton system. The attachments in arthropods allow for increased leverage and increased strength. I'm sure you've heard all those weird stats about ants, how they can lift some thousands upon thousands of times their body weight, or how fleas can jump way further than humans can. It's like us jumping over the Empire State Building or things like that. Some of the major reasons they can do that is because they have an exoskeleton with those internal attachments as opposed to an endoskeleton. It gives them that increased leverage, that increased strength. So the attachment between muscles and exoskeletons is actually 6 times stronger than the attachment between tendons and bones like we have in vertebrates. So have you ever heard those stories? Yeah, ants can lift a ridiculous amount of weight. Things can jump really high. It's because of these really strong attachments that increase leverage, that increased strength. The exoskeleton also prevents water loss. So arthropods are overall small. You don't see an arthropod that is the same size as a human or an elephant or something like that. They have a much higher, what we call surface to volume ratio, much higher than vertebrates and other members of Animalia. This high surface to volume ratio leads to an increase in heat and water loss all over the arthropod body. This can be a very dangerous situation for different arthropods, and so the exoskeleton helps to prevent too much of that water loss or that heat loss. Okay, so let's talk for a little bit about this surface to volume ratio concept. A high surface to volume ratio is a hallmark of many arthropods, but especially the insects. What this is saying is if you calculate the surface area of an organism and compare it to the calculated volume of that organism, the surface area is going to be very high in comparison. So let me illustrate that by using these cubes here. It's very easy to calculate the surface area and volume in cubes, right? Just think back to your basic biology class, or geometry classes, I should say. Let's say this small cube right here has a measurement of 1 centimeter per side, okay? If I wanted to calculate the area of one side of the cube, I would simply take 1 times 1, the length times the width. So my area of a single side is 1 centimeter squared. Now, once I figure out that surface area, I can take that 1 squared and multiply it by 6, the number of surfaces on this cube. Top and bottom is 2, side to side is 2, front and back is 2, 2, 4, 6. Okay, so I take 1 square, multiply it by 6, and that gives me a surface area of 6 centimeters squared, right? Pretty straightforward. Now, to figure out the volume, all I have to do is multiply the length by the width by the height. So length and width for the area, length, width, height for the volume. In this case, that's 1 times 1 times 1, and I end up with a volume of 1 cubed, or 1, just to make it easy right here. Okay, cool. So if I want to figure out my surface to volume ratio in this case, surface to volume, that's just dividing the surface by the volume. Okay, so we got a surface area of 6, a volume of 1, surface divided by volume, 6 divided by 1 equals 6. Pretty straightforward. So in this case, this tiny cube has a surface to volume ratio of 6. Now, what's going to happen if I have a bigger cube? Let's say I double the size of this cube. So it's going from a height of 1 centimeter to a height of 2 centimeters. I can do the exact same math, right? My surface area, 2 times 2, and it times that by 6, same calculation, surface area for the full cube, 2 squared times 6 equals 24. And then my volume is 2 times 2 times 2, which equals 8. Okay, so if I wanted to figure out the surface to volume ratio in this case, I would take the surface area of 24 and divide it by 8. In that case, I now have a surface to volume ratio of 3. So as I double the size of this cube, I half the size of that surface to volume ratio. Okay, good to know. Now, I can do these same calculations if I add on another layer here. So now I've got a side of 3 and a length of 3 instead of 2. So in this case, a side equals 3. Okay, and then the surface area is 3 squared times 6. That's 54. And then the volume is 3 times 3 times 3. Great. Okay, so we got 27. In this case, it's 54 surface divided by the volume of 27, which equals 2. So the bigger you get, the smaller your surface to volume ratio. So what this is showing you is this idea of the bigger an organism is, the smaller its surface to volume ratio gets. So this means that the amount of volume in the object is growing faster than the overall surface area. And this concept holds true with living things. The bigger an animal is, the smaller its surface to volume ratio. So what does this mean to animals? Having a high surface to volume ratio, so being a very tiny animal, means that physical forces are acting on the surface of the organism rather than on the volume. There's just so much of that surface area to act upon. The bigger animals, on the other hand, the ones with a much lower surface to volume ratio, think humans and horses and elephants and giraffes, really, really large organisms, those have physical forces that act primarily on the volume or on the mass of the organism. So think about this for a second. How would something like a major physical force in the world, like gravity, affect a larger organism versus a smaller one? Think about that. So gravity acts on the volume or on the mass of an organism. If you've taken any physics at all, you know you can calculate the force of gravity using the mass of an object and some other details. And the more mass present, the more there is for the gravity to act upon. Therefore, gravity is going to affect more massive things in a much greater way. I'm sure you've heard the old adage of the bigger they are, the harder they fall. That holds true because of physics. Now, there's a very famous biological quote that goes, "You can drop a mouse down a 1,000-yard mine shaft, and on arriving at the bottom, it gets a slight shock and walks away. A rat is killed, a human is broken, and a horse splashes." This is a simple illustration showing how gravity affects larger and larger masses. Because mice are mostly small, they don't hit the ground as hard as a rat does, which doesn't hit the ground as hard as a human, which doesn't hit the ground as hard as a horse. This is why you can watch an ant fall from a ridiculous height and just walk away. Have you ever done that? You see an insect, a really tiny insect somewhere up high, and it falls, you go, "Oh my God." Oh, nope, it's fine. It just gets up. It doesn't even hurt it because the physical force of gravity is no big deal to it. It has a much higher surface to volume ratio. A fall that would kill you or me is just another way of moving around for a bug. This is also why it's much easier for little tiny children to fall down and get back up than it is when you get older, right? Along with a bunch of other things. But you get bigger, and so gravity hurts you a little bit more. The world is a jerk, man. Now, but what about other physical forces? What about, say, heat? This is something that works on surface area rather than volume. What about water surface tension? This also works on surface area. The same thing with dehydration. You and I lose some heat from our bodies, but not as much as smaller things. We also have no problem with water surface tension, right? You can jump into a pool and pop right back out. That same surface tension, though, that same cohesive attraction between water molecules, it's way too strong for something as small as an ant or an aphid to break through. Insects and small arthropods can actually drown in a drop of water because they cannot break through the surface tension of that water. It's like us running into a brick wall. It's just too strong for us. But there are certain animals that can run through that brick wall like it's not even there, right? They're much bigger. They can just power their way through. because their surface to volume ratio is even smaller than ours. They can use that volume to power their way through. So this surface to volume ratio is exceptionally important when it comes to how insects survive in the world. Insects and other small organisms are affected very differently by different forces. Gravity is of negligible importance, while any force that works on the surface area is very important. All right, so we've got bilateral symmetry, segmented appendages, and an exoskeleton made with chitin. The next major characteristic is an externally segmented body. Because of that exoskeleton, because of that suit of armor, the arthropod has to have segmentation along the external surface to allow for movement. You can see the segments very, very easily in some things, like this millipede right here. See all those little segments on the outside? Yeah. Or these pill bugs, these roly-polies right here, you can see those segments really, really easily. It's a little harder in other organisms. You can see some segments in this caterpillar a little bit, but they're not as deep as you see them in here. This is because there's more scleritin in this exoskeleton and this one than there is in this one. This is much more chitinous than it is scleritinized. The same thing with this fly. Any of these little lines here, we call them sutures or seams. These are those externally segmented bodies that allow for movement. Okay, now they are present in all arthropods though, and the number of external segments varies on the type, depending on the type of arthropod. So we've got bilateral symmetry, segmented appendages, an exoskeleton made with chitin, and externally segmented bodies. The final external characteristic has to do with the mouth parts. All arthropods have appendages that are specifically modified for feeding. So depending on the life history of the insect, the mouth parts can show extents of modification. Some mouth parts, like the mouth parts of the cockroach here, look right there, they haven't changed much in many, many millennia. They're still used for chewing, and they look an awful lot like the mouth parts of ancient arthropods. Other organisms, on the other hand, have very specialized mouth parts, and these are based on the types of food they feed on and how they've evolved over those same millennia. So those insects that feed on liquids trapped inside of something like blood, or those that feed on plant phloem or xylem, they have what are called piercing and sucking mouth parts. So we'll see a lot of these when we get to the mosquitoes, those blood feeders that are out there. These mouth parts have formed like a hypodermic needle, and they allow the insect to puncture through skin and suck out fluids, or puncture through the outer surface of a plant and suck out the fluids. Butterflies and moths, on the other hand, tend to feed on nectar. So nectar is found at the base of flowers. It's basically freely given as an incentive for pollination, if you remember back to your basic biology and botany courses. So their mouth parts are shaped a lot like straws. That's what we're looking at here. They're really, really long. Oftentimes we see different butterflies and moths that have co-evolved with certain flowers. So their mouth parts are going to have the exact same length as it takes to get to the base of that flower and get to that nectar. All they need to do is uncoil those mouth parts and probe into that flower and suck out that nectar. So they don't need to pierce into anything necessarily, they just suck it out like a straw. Some organisms need to scrape away at the surface of their food. So instead of having these big jaws like a cockroach, instead they have these little tiny teeth-like organs on the end of their mouth parts that act like sandpaper. They can scrape away the surface or wear away the surface, and then either feed on those cells that they've scraped away or the fluids that well up after scraping that stuff away. We call these rasping mouth parts. Still others, like this fly right here, have what we call sponging mouth parts. These are mouth parts that engage in something called exodigestion. Basically, what they do is instead of taking in food and letting it digest in their stomach or small intestine like humans do fully, they puke up those digestive juices, those digestive enzymes onto their food. They wait for that liquefaction to happen. Because of that digestion, it happens outside their bodies, hence exodigestion. And then they sponge up or soak up those nutrients, just as if you're wiping something up off the counter with a sponge. So these sponging mouth parts don't have any obvious opening, not like this big hole here, or these tubes, or anything like that. It's just like taking a sponge out of your sink and soaking something up. They have these tiny little pores in the base of these mouth parts that allow for fluids to enter and exit. Well, that's the extent of the external characteristics that make up an arthropod. Up next, we'll get into the 5 internal characteristics that all arthropods have in common. Let me know if you have any questions. All right, we're going to stop there for now. Let me know if you have any questions.